scatter when I shine the bright light of reason. I'm Larry Elder. Join me tonight at 7 right here on AM 560, The Answer.
Dan and Amy, good news with respect to GDP growth. U.S. economy grew a little bit faster than initially thought, revised upward to 3% from April to June from the originally reported 2.7%. So that's a little bit of encouraging news.
Didn't I predict 6% by the end of the year?
You're very optimistic.
I am.
You and Steve Moore are the two.
Well, he went 12%. I went 6%.
The two unadulterated optimists. There's no question. This less good news. From 2013 to 2016, the average tax bill for Americans increased 41% to the point where this is the reality. People living in a single household, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics, which includes families, financial independent individuals, people living in a single household who share expenses, so it runs the gamut. The average American spent more on federal, state, and local taxes than they did on food and clothing combined. So that gives you a little bit of perspective in terms of where your household budget is being distributed or redistributed thanks to government. Of course, that's even more pronounced in Illinois, where you have the highest state and local tax burden in the country. So tax reform is a salient issue. It was also a central promise of the Trump candidacy, which is why he was in Springfield, Missouri yesterday, taking up the issue and outlining the principles that should inform tax reform.
Here are my 4 principles for tax reform. First, we need a tax code that is simple, fair, and easy to understand. That means getting rid of the loopholes and complexity that primarily benefit the wealthiest Americans and special interests. Second, we need a competitive tax code that creates more jobs and higher wages for Americans. It's time to give American workers the pay raise that they've been looking for many, many years. The third principle for tax reform is a crucial one: tax relief for middle-class families. In a way, and I've been saying this for a long time, they've been sort of the forgotten people. But they're not forgotten any longer, I can tell you that. Fourth and finally, we want to bring back trillions of dollars in wealth that's parked overseas.
So there you go. Those are the 4 principles. How to translate those principles into actual policy that Republican majorities can get behind and move to the president's desk. For that, we turn to our friend Steve Cortes, Fox News contributor, former head of Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. Steve, thanks for being with us.
Dan, good morning. Thanks for having me.
So he outlined the principles. Those are really not in very much controversy. They're kind of long-standing, center-cut GOP principles. Rand Paul saying he's ready to take up tax reform. Everybody's ready to take up tax reform. So how optimistic should we be that we're going to get something that comports with Trump's principles?
Well, we'll see, Dan. I would say I'm guardedly optimistic. And the reason I'm guardedly optimistic and not incredibly optimistic is because of the way that Senate Republicans lately have been willing to war with the president in a very public way. I think they've been hesitant, to say the least, about implementing his agenda from the very beginning. I think from the time he was elected, quite frankly. But the fact that they're being public about it now, people like Senator Corker questioning even his stability, that worries me. I think that, and I'll say this as a Trump partisan, I think those Senate Republicans need to wake up to what America said loudly in 2016, which is that the status quo is not okay, and nowhere more so than when it comes to economic growth. We've had a decade of sluggish, slow economic growth in this country, and not just that, the benefits of that slow growth have flowed almost entirely to the very highest income earners in our society, to the top 1%. The average American worker has yet to have a pay increase in this century, and it's 2017. So it is high time that middle America starts to see its economic prosperity grow. I'm so glad that he went literally to the middle of the country to talk about middle America, and this is a necessity. So I think we'll get it done, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it. I'd bet a small car, not a large car, because the Senate Republicans worry me.
Right, but I mean, it lacked a lot of specifics yesterday, so I want to know, who will see the cuts, what will the cuts be, and how are they going to pay for it all?
Right. And Amy, listen, I'm glad you asked. First of all, in terms of pay for it all, if I can start with your last point first, I don't believe personally that we have to pay for it. It's our money. The government should figure out how it can control spending. But if it can't, I don't think we should be penny wise but pound foolish. In other words, we need economic growth. And the only way we're going to ever solve our entitlement problems in this country, the demographic and entitlement problems that are looming, the only way we can possibly afford our entitlements is by much, much faster economic growth. So perhaps we increase the deficit in the near term, but in the long term, faster economic growth not only will benefit the people, but will actually also greatly benefit government. But in terms of who will get the cuts, so I think this is so important because the Democrats, as they often do, and even some squishy Republicans, I think, are starting to already demagogue that this is a giveaway to the rich. A lot of wealthy people who live in high tax places like Chicago, like California, New York, under the president's proposals, their taxes may very well actually go up because they're going to lose some of the massive deductions of their property and state income taxes. So if you're a W-2 high earner, you work for a law firm in Los Angeles, or you work for a Wall Street bank in Manhattan, under Trump's proposals, you may very well actually not get a tax break because you live in those high tax places. But you know who's absolutely going to get a tax break no matter where they live? Are middle-class people, the ones that still pay taxes. So this is tax relief for everyone, and it's economic growth that we so badly need. We got a great GDP print finally. That's good news. Things are getting better out there in the economy. That's also great news. Consumer confidence, 17-year high. Manufacturing index, all-time high. So good things are happening. If we just now add in, we've got a small fire burning. If we throw the gasoline of tax cuts on and tax reform, that fire turns into a big, wonderful bonfire. And we can do it, and we need it. We need economic growth in this country.
So if, you talk about the squishy Senate Republicans, what we found out with the Obamacare repeal and replace saga is you've just got a number of big government Republicans in both chambers, but most damagingly in the Senate. That's just a reality. And so they're, as you suggested, susceptible to class warfare demagoguery. They indulge it themselves. And so, so with respect to Trump, in the campaign, he talked about perhaps being willing to go after, say, cajillionaire hedge fund managers specifically, go after Wall Street for the benefit of Main Street. Do you think he's going to need, and should he do this if it's a necessity politically? Should he keep the top marginal rate where it's at, maybe even have some kind of surcharge, different tax treatment for those hedge fund managers, and use that as a lever to flatten out and lower the rates, lower all the other rates, and get the lowest corporate rate possible?
Right. Should he, if necessary? Yes, I do believe so. And the carried interest deduction, which is the biggest loophole that benefits private equity and Wall Street people, hedge fund people, right now the White House's proposal is to eliminate that. Now, I'm not very optimistic that's going to get through Congress because I do think those folks have a lot of senators by the short hairs. But I hope it does, and it should. And yes, the problem with the complexity of our tax code is not just the taxes are too high, and they are, but it's also, and I'm so glad the president really spoke to this yesterday, just how complex they are. Albert Einstein, who we could all agree was a pretty smart guy, he once said, the hardest thing in the world to understand is the U.S. income tax code. So we shouldn't have to be world-class physicists to understand our taxes. Particularly for sort of regular earning folks, it should be a one-page document that they can do themselves, that they don't need to hire an accountant. So who loves that complexity, though? The very wealthy, because quite frankly, they're the ones who are able, through skilled lobbyists, through lawyers, to manipulate the tax code and to create loopholes that they then benefit from. So giant corporations and extremely high net worth individuals love the complexity of the tax code. And that's why Donald Trump, and listen, I get the paradox here that it's a Manhattan billionaire is the one who is finally standing up, I think, for regular wage earners in America who are struggling. And that's, to me, of the many reasons that he won in 2016, the number one reason was the economic anxiety that people feel out there, that they see every day, struggling to pay their bills. And by the way, it's not just a matter of economic prosperity. I really believe that so many of the problems in our society today, so many of them are, at least in part, due to that economic anxiety. It exacerbates many other tensions. And I think one of the reasons we're so divided as a country is because of that economic angst. So I think growth solves many, many problems. We already are, as I said, we're seeing progress already. There's an optimism out there. You wouldn't know it if you listen to mainstream media, but there's an optimism in the country. Deregulation has already started. He was able to do much of that on his own by executive order. Now, if we throw in tax cuts, we really get this economy roaring like we haven't seen since the 1980s and 1990s. And once we do get that, if and when we get that, I think you're going to see a society that becomes a lot more cohesive. And I also think you're going to see a president who is really revered, even though right now he's largely reviled, particularly by mainstream media.
And people really should take a look at their portfolios or their 401k. I mean, we're doing well.
Right.
I mean, the past 6 months, I've made more than I have the whole entire year before.
Right.
I'm not going to tell you my secrets, Dan. So don't look at me for any stock tips. But the stock, I mean, it's
you have somebody else invest your money. That's your
exactly.
secret.
That's my secret. But is Paul Ryan going to be part of this conversation when it comes to tax reform?
You know, I mean, certainly he'll be part of the conversation. I'm not a very big fan of leadership on the Hill, either on the Senate or the House side, to be very honest. Paul Ryan, I think, and Mitch McConnell are basically happy with the status quo. They'll never say that to us publicly, but I think their actions show it. Or they want to tinker around the edges. They want to do a very sort of traditional Republican tax cut, which is, we're going to move some rates, we're going to create some loopholes. At the end of the day, it doesn't do very much for working Americans, really helps a few special interests. That's what they did during the Bush years. There was actually a tax cut a year during the Bush years, but I don't think most Americans felt it or even knew it because they were those kind of tax cuts. It wasn't transformational. It wasn't true tax reform. But here's the thing. On the House side, at least, I think because House Republicans generally live in districts where they actually fear the president and his voters, on the House side, whether they want to or not, I think those House Republicans are going to get in line. The Senate's a very different story because many of them don't fear him at all in their home states, or they're not running for 4 or 6 years. So you have people like Corker in Tennessee who just seems to be obstructionist, quite frankly, toward the president. Certainly both Arizona senators, Flake and McCain, Heller in Nevada, Collins in Maine. So there's a lot of Republicans who, in my opinion, aren't really Republicans. I think when it comes to the Senate, it's not so much Republican and Democrat. It's really Trump against Washington. And I have to admit, sadly, Washington's been winning, certainly won on health care. Washington loves the status quo on health care. Let's be honest about it. They do. K Street loves it. Obamacare is wonderful for K Street. Think of the lobbying money, the special interest for pharma, for big health care. They love Obamacare. But who doesn't? Regular people who can't go to their doctor anymore because their deductibles are stinking high. Same thing on taxes. Regular people who don't make very much money but have to hire an accountant and can't believe that they spend more on taxes than they do on food and clothing. This is lunacy. And Trump was elected not to do small things. That's why we as a people chose an outsider, someone who's never been in politics before, someone who's made his life in business, a mogul, a titan of industry, to go to Washington, again, not to tinker on the edges, but to smash this crony system. Now, is he going to succeed? I think so. But again, I'm worried. I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm worried about those Senate Republicans.
All right. He is Steve Cortes, Fox News contributor and former head of Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. Steve, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about